Okay, welcome to this week's Parsha class on Parsha Vayeshev with commentary by Nechama Leibovich. Um, and this week, my computer just signed me out of my source sheet. I based the class on her essay, which very closely aligned with one of her Gilionot on the same topic. And I was about halfway through my 9-page source sheet when I thought, like, maybe this is crazy and I should switch to something else. And then I thought, no, this is the right choice. Let me keep going. And I got to the end and I felt confirmed that it was the right choice. And I think what is stunning about this essay, and hopefully we'll see the arc of it, even though we, of course, will not read every word of our long 9-page source sheet, is that I think that one of the things that Nechama Leibovich sort of brings to life from the commentaries is using a very sort of specific jumping off point. Sorry, I'm just putting my password back in so I can see the source sheet. Using a very specific jumping off point to talk about a larger worry or a larger issue in a very subtle way. Like I feel like often more modern commentaries, even, such as Rabbi Lord Jonathan Sacks or some other famous newer commentaries, come out with their current problem, right? Their thesis or their interesting hook right away, right? That's how why you rabbis are trained today. Like tell your interesting story first, then dip into the Torah. And I think Nechama Leibovich follows that more old school tradition of exploring the problem and then saying what's on her mind, like what drove her to explore that in 9 pages in depth. Hello, Judith. And hello, Nelson. Welcome, everybody. So I'm going to share the source sheet here. And as I said, we're not going to look at every word. That would be crazy. I got a little ahead of myself here. But we will look at the problem and try to understand some of the different ways that the Mefarshim try to understand the problem. So, okay, with that very brief introduction, this pasuk here, this is the problem. And the way that I would phrase the problem is as I read it out loud, let's pretend all of you are directors of the theater production of Parsha Vayeshev, and think about how many characters are standing on your stage and where they are standing and which direction they're moving in. And tell me at the end what you think, right? Okay. V'avru anashim midyanim socharim. So Midianite traders passed by. V'yimshechu v'ya'alu et Yosef min habor. They pulled Joseph out of the pit. V'yimcharu et Yosef liyishmaelim be'esrim kasef. They sold Joseph for 20 pieces of silver to the Ishmaelites. V'yaviu et Yosef mitzrayma, who then brought Yosef to Egypt. Okay, so how many actors or groups of actors are on stage?
Well, it depends how many traders there were.
Totally, but let's assume the group of traders is one actor.
Oh. Well, you have the Midianites, the traders that passed by and pulled Joseph out of the pit. Okay. And then you have the Ishmaelites who brought Joseph to Egypt. So that's 3, including Joseph.
Excellent. Thank you, Sherry, for playing the game. And so far, I think 3 is a reasonable number. Does anyone come up with a different number? Okay, so let me ask a sort of more meta question. Who sells Yosef? If I just asked you that before we even looked at this pasuk, who's the missing actor, I guess is what I'm asking you.
The brothers.
The brothers, right? I feel like anyone who's interacted with this story in some way or another would say Yosef's brothers sold him into slavery. So it turns out, right, that maybe there's actually 4 actors here. There's the Midianite traders, there's Yosef, that's obvious, right? But the they, which we, and I think Sherry correctly sort of on the pshat level, assume to be the Midianites because, right, in a proper sentence, the proper noun, right, it refers back to the last specific character. But we assume, and we'll see why in a second, that the brothers are the they here. So there's actually 4 actors, right? Midianite, Yosef, brothers. But it's a really unfair question, and I think, Sherry, that your answer is the right one, right, on the surface. And so I think that the question here, right, her first sentence, this chapter constitutes a turning point in the life of Yosef and the history of the Jewish people, for it marks the descent of the Israelites into Egypt. And I think that that is why we spend so much time focusing on how many actors are in this pasuk, because this is a moment of extraordinary multi-generational trauma, right? It's like where everything comes to a head, where it's no longer possible to sort of walk it back, right? Anyone who's like seen a fight before, you can like tell that moment where someone's like about to throw a punch or destroy someone else's artwork or whatever the thing is, however old the people are, there's always that moment. This is that moment, right? And I think that that's why it's so important to think about who the actors are here. So Rashi, who often really shapes the way we think about pshat, even when it's not pshat, is the one who adds the 4th character, right? He says here, Vayimshechu b'nei Yaakov et Yosef min habor, right? So who is the they? Who's Vayimshechu? They drew him out. He says it's the children of Yaakov who drew Yosef out of the pit. V'yimcharuhu liYishmaelim. They sold him to the Ishmaelim, right? So they're the brothers. V'yishmaelim lemidyanim, v'hamidyanim lemitzrayim. So Rashi adds in an extra step, and he is relying heavily, as Nacham Levitch will tell us, on the Midrash here. But he adds in a step, right? The Midianite traders, right? One of the questions I asked is like, where would we put these people on the stage? It's possible that the Midianite traders are sort of far out, like near the stage wing, or whatever we call that part where you walk onto the stage, right? They're just passing by. It's unclear what role they play here. It definitely seems, again, from the pshat, that the Ishmaelim and the they, whoever the they is, are the primary actors here. But Rashi adds in a 3rd layer where the Midyanim are the ones who actually bring him into Egypt, right? He's quoting the Midrash Tanchuma, but it's confusing because we have not really talked about these Midyanim, right? She brings a pasuk that is, right, let's see, this pasuk is Kafchet 28. So she brings 3 psukim before. The brothers look up and they see the Orchat Yishmaelim, right? They don't mention the Midyanim. And then one pasuk before, right, when Yehuda mentions selling him, he says, "L'chu v'nimcharenu liyishmaelim," not to the Midyanim, right? Till that point, nothing had been mentioned of the Midianite merchants. And so it's hard to understand what role the Midianites play here. Rashi tries to overcome this difficulty following Talmudic exegesis by postulating a 3-fold sale: the brothers to the Ishmaelites, to the Midianites, to Egypt. And evidently, Rashi identifies the Midianites mentioned at the end of the chapter, right? So we're scooting ahead now. V'hamidyanim machru oto el Mitzrayim lePotifar. So the text is complicated. And I think I've been thinking about this for the last 24 hours since I started down this rabbit hole. I think that often with stories of extraordinary trauma, there are lots of different ways of thinking about it, right? If you ever watched like Law and Order or some real crime show, it like turns out that witness memory is faulty memory, and someone is so sure that they saw their ex-family member do the bad thing, but really it was someone else, right? And I think that like part of the confusion here swirls around this issue of traumatized memory. That's my own take, not Nachama Leibovich's. Right? She is saying though that Rashi is at least in part basing his explanation on the fact that it does seem like the Ishmaelim have been lost by the time we get to Egypt. And so the Midianim must have had more than a passing role in this story, because how did he get there? But then in chapter, I don't know why she puts it in this sort of funny order, right? Chapter 39, verse 1. So 2 prakim later, when we're talking about this again, it tells us that Potiphar, this Cerise Paro, the prefect, the Egyptian official, bought him miyad ha-Yishmaelim, right? We go back to the Yishmaelim. So again, it's very confusing. And one of the reasons I chose this chapter is there's some new interesting commentaries. One of them is the Mizrahi, Rashi's super commentary and champion, but even he is forced to admit that he doesn't know what Rashi would do with this verse here, meaning it's very difficult to make the Midianim and the Yishmaelim collapsed in any way, because here it seems like the Yishmaelim were the ones who sold him into Egypt, but Rashi says it was the Midianim. Of course, Rashi is basing it on this pasuk, not the latter one. Okay, so far, right, we have our problem, which is where do the brothers fit into this story of the narrative of selling Yosef? Rashi's answer is to say they are front and center. They are the they. They are the ones who do the selling, and the Midianites and the Ishmaelim are sort of swirling around as buyers in this story, but not as sellers. So far, so good? Okay. So I want us to look at the Chizkuni, and I'm sorry, I hope I don't make people dizzy when I do this. I'm just going to pull us down to the last page. Oh boy, uh-oh. Oh, I lost it. Oh, here we go. Am I still paused though? Can you see my screen? Oh, oh dear. Hold on. My screen share has stopped. Hold on 1 second. I was just trying to locate the Chizkuni for us. Oops. I'm sorry, guys. My computer is going a sort of funny, slow way today. Okay, we're going to reshare. Have no fear. Okay, you can see again? Hopefully, yes. Okay. So I was just going to pull us down to the Chizkuni, who is someone that I am familiar with, but actually did not know a lot about. Here we go. The Chizkuni is a 13th century French commentary, and the details of his biography are very unknown. He's Chizkia ben Manoach, and he has a Torah commentary, which is actually a compilation of insights, but in the 13th century, you didn't have to quote your sources. And so he just sort of compiles them without naming them because he felt like the message was more important than the messenger. And also you should go back and look at the Mizrahi sometime. He's in Turkey because he has an interesting biography of his own. Okay, let's scroll back up to the Chizkuni here. So the Chizkuni offers another interpretation. And he adds in some color here, right? While the brothers were debating about, right, they look up in Pasuk 27, Kaf Zayin. Yehuda says, maybe we should sell him to the Ishmaelites. So we know the Ishmaelites are approaching from stage right, let's say, right? But Hayu medabrim beinehem, right? While they're still talking about it, the Midianites had come from stage left, whichever one I didn't say, I forget, right? And they saw Yosef in the pit. So the brothers are sort of far away. We'll see why perhaps later. And they see the Ishmaelites, they don't see the Midianites, and the Midianites like scoop him up and sell him out from under the brothers, is sort of how it seems. And it seems like in part they took pity on him. Nebuch, he was like sitting in this pit and crying, and they make him presentable and they sell him to the Ishmaelites. Following this, the Ishmaelites sold Yosef back, right? Back is not here, but that has to be implied, to the Midianites, who in turn sold him to Potiphar. So to sum up, right, because it goes on for a while, the brothers sold Yosef to the Midianites. This sale has not been recorded in the Torah because it was only for like an hour. Then the Midianites sold him to the Ishmaelites. Right, that's the story that we've seen. This sale was also not recorded in the Torah, seeing that the Ishmaelites resold Yosef as soon as possible and secretly, not a public auction, as they were afraid that the Midianites wished to cancel the sale and sell him to Potiphar instead, getting a much better price. When Potiphar saw Yosef in the possession of the Midianites and realized how handsome a slave this would be, he could not understand why a white person would sell a fellow white-skinned person. They usually only sold Negroes, although the reverse would have made sense to him. He therefore reasoned that Yosef could not have been born as a slave, and consequently he demanded an ironclad guarantee that the Midianites had not kidnapped him. The guarantee that the Midianites furnished was that they had bought him from the Ishmaelites, from whom they had purchased Yosef, to confirm this for Potiphar. And this is why the Torah writes that Potiphar purchased Yosef from the Ishmaelites, who confirmed they had sold him legitimately. So I think that the Chizkuni, right? I love the way that Nechama Leibovich talks about the Mefarshim, because she is not afraid to call a spade, right? The Chizkuni approach is rather complicated, and she'll go on to say why she thinks there is actually a flaw. But first, she names two advantages. The first is that the many and clandestine sales fit in well with the atmosphere of dealing in stolen property. The way that the Chizkuni talks about it, I have to say, it feels to me like sex trafficking, right? They've picked up this beautiful young man. They keep him in such good condition that the buyer is worried that, right, the police are going to knock on his door and say, actually, this person was kidnapped. This is not a true slave, whatever that means to the Chizkuni in the 13th century in France. But interesting to me that he already had this very race-based idea of what slavery was, and that Yosef didn't really fit in. It's also interesting because there is a whole sexual scandal in Potiphar's house, and it seems like Yosef was purchased based on his beauty, right? It's almost like a foreshadowing to what's to come for him. So I think there are a lot of really interesting things here. But I think that the idea that this was a no bona fides transaction is also interesting, right? It adds like a layer to the trauma in some way. It's like very rushed and quick and filled with anxiety on all the players' parts. But she likes it because it also disposes of the contradiction, right? We can have both psukim. The Midianites sold Yosef, and Potiphar bought him from the Ishmaelites, because the Ishmaelites were the ones who vouched for the legality of the sale. So the flaw, however, right, is that he is listing sales that don't occur, right? This is worse than Rashi. Rashi is adding characters. The Chizkuni is adding whole plot lines. So she brings the Ramban, a friend of ours who we've seen before, who suggests a different explanation. And he does something interesting where he conflates the two caravans, the Midianites and the Ishmaelites, as one, in which the Midianites are the merchants and the Ishmaelites are the camel drivers. And so they just are working together. And partially this is based on some psukim where the children of Abraham, right, from his concubines that are listed at the very end of his life are listed, right, Yishmael, which we know, and someone named Midian. And so perhaps like they're cousins, right, perhaps, or brothers, and, you know, half brothers, and they live, they work together. So that's an interesting idea, right? The Ramban then shows that the Torah often attributes a deed, sometimes to its ultimate author and sometimes to its intermediary, right? He's also trying to work out this why it says Yishmaelites in one place and Midianites in another. And so that's fine, right? So he and the Ibn Ezra, they want to conflate. So now we're back to three characters: the Midianite Ishmaelite caravan, Yosef, and the brothers, right? Because the Midianites can't sell him to the Ishmaelites. They're sort of one and the same caravan. Irrespective of the differences between these commentators, right? The Ibn Ezra and the Ramban have sort of similar but different ideas. They have this in common. The brothers who are not mentioned in our text at all are regarded as the understood subject. They drew Joseph out of the pit and they sold Joseph. This interpretation would be seen to be born out of Joseph's own words when he revealed his identity to his brothers. I am Yosef, your brother, whom you sold into Egypt. Right? So this pasuk, which shows up far later when the brothers have their reunion with Yosef, right? Again, when we think about this as like layers of trauma, like who knows what is real? But in Yosef's mind, it's very clear. Whether the brothers got Yosef scooped out from under them while they were debating selling him, or they actively sold him themselves, I think for me, like the psychological trauma is clear. For Yosef, it was the same. It doesn't really matter. Right, sort of like what the Rambam was saying, right? Like if you plan the whole thing, you get the credit for selling him, even if you don't actually get the 20 silver pieces or whatever. And both of them want to leave the brothers in the story. Right, and I think that's an interesting thing. So far, all of the commentaries, Rashi, Ramban, Chizkuni, and Ibn Ezra, all want to put Yosef's brothers at the forefront of the sale, even though it is very clearly not the pshat of the text. But what Nechama Leibovich brings up, right, is that this approach has some difficulties at best. It leaves unexplained how Reuven remains ignorant of the sale. right? There is some like question about where Ruvain was, and then when he goes back to the pit and he can't find the brother, right? And then, right, she also points out that the children, the brothers, tell Yaakov that Yosef is dead. And it seems like she's uncomfortable with this idea, right? How could Yehuda have lied so explicitly and said that he was dead when he wasn't sure? And then I think she asks, maybe partially the most interesting question here. Had Rashi's contention been correct, that the brothers had sold him into the Egypt-bound caravan, why couldn't the brothers, after they had suffered complete remorse for their act, have hoped to trace him and mend matters? Right? If they really regretted it so much, why didn't they chase after the caravan and buy him back? I think it's such a good question, right? And it's honestly one I never thought about when I thought about the brothers doing the selling, right? In a fit of jealousy and like fraternal rage, they sell their brother. They quickly realize they've made a huge mistake. And instead of trying to fix it, it's like they've passed that point of no return. They just go with the lie that their brother had died. But that's not comfortable, right? Nechama Leibovich doesn't want that to be the solution to the problem. And so she brings us the Rashbam. I'm not going to scroll down in fear that I'm going to lose our place again, but we'll read about the Rashbam later. Another interesting commentary. Here, the Rashbam gives us some more insight into the psychological workings of this trauma. The brothers had sat down, right, to eat their meal. They distanced themselves, right? So we've got Yosef on one side of the stage, and instead of the brothers sitting with him and the Midianites in the distance and the Ishmaelites in the distance, the brothers are all the way on the other side. And he has this fascinating reading, which is that they didn't want to be guilty of eating while spilling blood, which is such a strange way of putting this problem. But I think it's probably, again, just sort of like on an emotional level, they didn't want to hear him crying. As mad as they were, and as much as they wanted to sell him, listening to your brother have like a panic attack in a pit is just not like a pleasant, eating music. And so they had seen the Ishmaelites in the distance, and they just don't want to wait listening to Yosef cry. It's so sad, right? And because of their inability to face their actions, it's during this time where when the Midianites come, see Yosef, pull him out, and sell him to the Ishmaelites, right? So the Rashbam is reading a very concrete read here. The brothers throw him in the pit, they walk away, the Midianites come, they pull him out and sell him. And he says right here, ויש לומר שהאחים לא ידעו ואף על פי שכתוב אשר מכרתם אותי מצרימה. One may assume that the brothers had no knowledge of this. Even though the Torah appears to attribute the sale later, we would have to say that was because they were instrumental in bringing about the sale, right? As I said, this is Yosef's trauma. The brothers were as good as the sellers because there's no other way to understand it. The Midianites are the ones that did the actual act of selling. And he says this line about the Midianites passing by, right, is described as totally coincidental. The brothers were waiting for the Ishmaelites. Even if the Torah says, V'yimcharu et Yosef li'Ishmaelim, this sounds as if the brothers did the selling. But it's possible that the brothers, noting the Midianites suddenly materializing out of nowhere, instructed them to pull Yosef out of the pit, after which they sold them themselves to the Ishmaelites. So here, the Midianites, who we thought were sort of independent actors in the story, are actually just like a prop. When they pass by, the brothers are ashamed, right? They're like, oh, we don't want the Midianites to see us behaving poorly. And so they try to cover up the scene of the crime. And once he's out of the pit, it's easier to sell him to the Ishmaelites. It's the Chizkuni doesn't say this, but it's almost as though I imagine that the Rashbam is imagining that if the Midianites had not come by, the brothers might not have actually pulled him out of the pit and sold him. It's almost as if the Midianites prompted the brothers to sell Yosef unintentionally. Right. So here, either the Rashbam wants to say that the brothers actually knew nothing about it, or that they really hadn't intended it and things sort of got out of control very quickly.
Well, one thing is for
right.
sure,
So
and that is that there were that Joseph was way outnumbered and that he really didn't have the slightest chance.
Yes, I think that's an excellent point, right? We think about Yosef as being alone in the pit, right? The pit was empty, he was all alone, but in fact, he was surrounded by people looking for a way to make a shekel off of his back, right? To punish him as the brothers were, or to sell him for cash to the Ishmaelites, or to sell him for Potiphar for even more money, as the text says. Yes, all of the sudden, I think it's a great point, Sherry. You can almost see all the characters sort of circling the pit and like pulling on different parts of Yosef. No, I want to sell him. No, I want to sell him, right? It is overwhelming, I think. I think that's a great point. But right, Nechama Leibush is quick to say twice that she finds the Rashbam forced. Right, this too is forced. The Rashbam advances the revolutionary but apt explanation that Joseph was sold without their knowledge, thus bearing out Yosef's contention, I was surely stolen from the land of the Hebrews, right? So Yosef himself has sort of two ways of thinking about this. I was stolen and my brother sold me into slavery. And so they imagine that there is this world in which the brothers return to the pit, ready to sell him to the Ishmaelites, and he is truly gone. And no one has any idea where he went. This letter from Luzzatto, who often is referred to as Shadal, is fascinating, and it took all of my willpower to cut it down further than I did. But he refers to this whole letter back and forth. It's super interesting. I just want to look at the Shadal's times. And I wanted to point out that we're talking about people across centuries, right? 13th century and 11th and 12th centuries. And then Shadal is all the way in the 1800s, like relatively modern, Italian. He was a prolific writer, right? Had lots of correspondence. And this one pasuk bothers everybody. Oh, excuse me. I think because, right, again, with this trauma, there's like a need to understand who really did what, how bad really was it, right? So the Shadal is already very long, and we're not going to read the whole thing, I promise. But she quotes the Shadal here, right, to really say that they did not know, right? So they were eating. The brothers say, Yehuda says, let us sell them. The brothers agree. But while they are eating, right, the Midianites have come. Meanwhile, right, also, since no hint is found in the verses that the Ishmaelites needed to come close to Yaakov's sons on their way, it seems like perhaps the drama of the sale takes place far away from the brothers entirely. And then behold, right, without any of them knowing, Midianite men, merchants crossed over by the pit by divine providence. The Midianites pulled him out, brought him, they sold him. Now behold, after they ate, Reuben hurried by himself, separating from his brothers to return to the pit to bring him out, right? It's gone far enough. We're still at a point where we can go back and make it better. However, I just thought this was so beautiful. I left this piece in. Kahamas doneg mipnei ha'esh, as the melting of wax before the fire. Can namas lev Reuven, so melted Reuven's heart, right? You can like imagine that moment of pure panic. Reuven's like, okay, we taught the little, annoying brother a lesson. Now let's go home. And Yosef is gone. He is past the point of no return. He tears his garments because in his imagination, without a doubt, a bear or a lion hunted Yosef for its cubs, suffocating him to take him as prey, and it carried him off alive, as he was, his head on his thighs and on his stomach, to some hole or to some den, and that's why there was no blood or bones, right? So the Shadal is imagining that the brothers truly believed he had died. This was not a lie they told their father. They might have sort of
embellished.
Thank you. I'm trying to, right. They created this false evidence of the blood on the coat because they wanted to convince him, but they actually believed it, right? When Yaakov's sons came to their father and they saw how Yaakov mourned so exceedingly, they regretted what had been done. But what was to be done, right? They truly thought he was already dead. And so none of them sought out Yosef because all of them fully believed without any shadow of a doubt that he was hunted down and there was no hope to bring him back alive. And so I think that that is a super, super fascinating read of the story, right? that that they truly thought that he was dead, right? And that fits well with the being kidnapped because the Midianites really did kidnap him. And it seems like he really didn't think that they had brought him, that they had sold him at all, right? And this is the part about sort of them being of the same line. And so Joseph's statement that you sold me is no contradiction, since as Benno Jacob points out, right, her favorite Reform German rabbi, sale does not cover just the financial sale side of the transaction, but all the more general disposing of the subject, right? That both of these stories can be true at the same time. And that then he finds Yaakov finds a more convincing proof that it was not the brothers that sold him, right? Because of this sort of complicated idea about listening versus doing things, hearing them out. But okay, here we are at the last point. I'm sure we've gone a long time. And I think that this is where, right, this is again, like someone, a more modern commentary would start here, which is like, who cares? Who cares if the brothers got the 20 silver pieces or the Midianites did? The brothers clearly meant to do a bad thing, whether it got out of hand or it didn't get out of hand, or they actually did it, or they just sort of fell into it. At the end of the day, this terrible traumatic thing has happened that lasted that, right? Like, I was talking about this with someone else, like a friend, and I said, like, the slaves in Egypt didn't care whether the brothers sold him or the Midianites sold him, right? Like, they're just down in Egypt. But I think that she gives voice to two interesting answers, right? All of the answers that we looked at are like technical answers to decide who the actors are and what their intentions were. And I think here she does this amazing job right at the end of explaining why it matters. Does someone else want to read so you don't have to listen to me coughing out my lung? Hopefully not really. Don't worry, Dr. Cantor.
The main question is, how does this new interpretation affect the significance of the story as a whole? To this, Benno Jacob replied, the tribes had not been guilty of the sin of stealing a man and selling him, punishable by death, and for which there was no atonement, being tantamount to murder. God had contrived matters that their design was not implemented by them. Joseph was sold by strangers. Had it been by his brothers, it would not have been a permanent sale, since the sale of a Jew, whether to a heathen or another Jew, is redeemable. But Joseph was sold by heathens to heathens into eternal slavery. This is the force of the emphasis in the text that Potiphar, an Egyptian, bought him from the hand of the Ishmaelites. In spite of all this, the Almighty redeemed him from Egyptian slavery, a foretaste of what was to happen to all Israel, all the tribes of Jacob and Egypt in the house of bondage, from which the Lord would bring them out from slavery to freedom.
Thank you, Sherry. That was beautiful. Right. So I think he brings up two fascinating ideas. One is like the brothers don't come off good no matter how you cut the story. But it seems like if they sold Yosef, they did something really with no return to it. Because that would be something that was punishable by death, no atonement, tantamount to murder, right? And that I do think like the Mefarshim struggle, like how do we make these really real people who made this huge mistake not into felons, right? Or villains? How do we keep them sort of on the right side of morality? How do we keep their mistake like in line with what we want their character to be? So that's one piece that I think is super interesting. And then it very much matters what the intention is. Even if at the end of the day they're blamed, they didn't really mean it, that's much better, right? I can see why we want to go that route. I can see the appeal of the shadal here. I think her other reason is even more fascinating, which is to say that, and I didn't know this, and I haven't had time to do like a deep dive into what she's referring to, but it seems like when someone Jewish sells someone else Jewish, there's sort of an end date, no matter who buys the person. But two non-Jewish actors, it's as I love that emphasis, Sherry, right? It's eternal slavery. It's forever. And so Yosef was sold into eternal slavery, and yet Hashem redeemed him. And so that gives all of us hope that whenever we feel as though there is no light at the end of the tunnel, as though the slavery is eternal, we know we've seen that God will redeem us anyway. Right. And so we see that with Yosef, and then we see it in terms of Yetziat Mitzrayim. But I think that the implication here, right, is that it's still true. Even if we find ourselves in Galut, or we find ourselves in what feels like slavery, or something terrible happens, there's no such thing as eternal slavery, because God is always there and always going to bring us out. And that transforms the story. I don't want to take away the tragedy and the trauma, because Yosef was sold one way or the other and had to endure a scary set of years. But I do think that there's something very beautiful about transforming this into a story of hope, right? It's kind of like about where you leave the ending. If the ending of this chapter is the trauma, then it's Yosef feeling kidnapped and stolen all at the same time. But if the ending is Yetziat Mitzrayim, this is that beautiful foreshadowing of a future redemption and continued future redemption throughout history. So again, I struggle to say like it's worth it, but I think it just changes maybe the focus of the trauma in some way. And so I really liked it. I couldn't stay away, even though it turned out to be a bigger beast than I was ready for. I think that she brings really interesting questions, but we should not explore them right now, because it has been a long but hopefully interesting 40 minutes. So I'm going to stop my share and welcome thoughts, comments, ideas, questions.
Yeah, can you hear me? Yeah, yeah. I was thinking all along. I came in late, but I tried to catch up, and I was thinking, where is this going? I couldn't understand what was the end point here. And then the end, when you pointed out that even if he had not been sold by Jews to Jews, he still was redeemed by God. And I think the point is God is the Redeemer, period. I think that.
Yes, we think along the same lines. Nelson, what I said at the beginning is like halfway through creating the source sheet, I was like, maybe this is boring. Like, what is the point? And when I read back over the end, I was convinced. I think it's just a different style. Like a modern commentary approaches it from the beginning, so you know where they're going. And she sort of patiently weaves the story together. And then like when she gives it to you at the end, you're like, oh, of course, it all sort of clicks into place. There's a beauty to it, but you have to have a patience for sure. Yes, I totally agree with you, right? The whole point of this trauma is to show us that God will redeem us even when it seems we are unredeemable. And that is a very powerful message that I don't think we often think about in this parsha.
And when you were asking who was the extra player, and you thought Sherry said the brothers, maybe God is also a player to be inserted there.
I love that. That's fascinating, right? I think one of the commentaries even said that, right? Divine providence brought the Midianites over. It's as though God played a very subtle but strong role. Beautiful. I love that.
Yeah, God's there.
Oh, Judith, you are muted.
Who is it that mentions God as the agent here? It's Joseph. Every time someone gives him a project, he insists that it's God who's acting through him. That he's not an interpreter of dreams, it's up to God to inspire him. So
I
perhaps
wonder if that's because,
as
sorry,
a footnote to the end, you could say that, yeah, God is the Redeemer, but in part because Joseph believed it.
But I wonder, right? It's one of those interesting questions. Is Yosef insisting that because he somehow felt the hands of God the whole way through? Or because he didn't, right? He's like clinging to the God that is supposed to be involved in his story. I don't know. It's an interesting question.
Or both, maybe.
Yeah.
Hmm.
Amazing. Well, a lot to think about.
Yeah.
I'm going to stop the recording because I don't want to